Thanks so much for joining us from your home.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you in these strange circumstances.
Yes, it is odd. How have you done personally, being kind of stuck at home for a while? I know a lot of people handle it differently.
Yeah, we first of all, we are empty nesters, so it's pretty quiet around here. We're not trying to homeschool kids at the same time, so we can't really complain very much. And I'm on sabbatical this year, so it's actually been quite a productive time for me. I think my wife is learning that she liked it when I traveled a little more, so we're readjusting to that. We miss seeing our children, our adult children, except for a couple of who live in New York City, all live in the neighborhood here actually with us, and so it's disappointing to not be able to gather with them and our friends in the same way. But we've tried to get creative about those ways too. We do online baking afternoons where everybody like bakes cookies or muffins together to connect.
Oh, that sounds really fun. That's a great idea. Well, I think with everyone being stuck at home, it really creates a perfect time to discuss something that's really close to your heart, which is how we curate the spaces around us. And this is something that at Renew the Arts we've gotten more and more into, realizing that casting a vision for creatives and artists in the church is important, but that's not the whole story. Also, casting a vision for the people buying from artists or even patronizing artists is so important, and realizing that if the church is going to be a culturally productive institution, it's not just up to artists, it's up to artists and everyone else, because those relationships are so symbiotic. So you've done a lot of thinking and as well as writing. And for anyone who happens to not be familiar with your work, obviously you're professor of philosophy at Calvin College, right?
Yes.
And you're also editor-in-chief at Image Journal. And you've written a lot of books. I don't know how many. You?
I'm not sure. A dozen.
Thought that might be the case. Most notably for me, not necessarily speaking as an academic, but most notably for me, you're the author of You Are What You Love, as well as On the Road with St. Augustine. So that's just a quick intro for people who don't happen to know, might not happen to know who you are.
Mm-hmm.
But so you've done a lot of really great thinking about this topic. And I want to start off by asking for your definition of habit or habits, and how art in the home kind of plays into that.
Yeah, I think you're right, by the way. It is this strange season in which we find ourselves has been an opportunity for us to all maybe just become a little bit more aware of our environments, and to realize, maybe we weren't as intentional about shaping our environments as we should have been when we found ourselves sequestered in them for so long. You know, I think it was Winston Churchill who once said, "We shape the buildings that then shape us," right? So there's a sense in which I think we need to appreciate that our material environments aren't just cases that we move in. They are these formative contexts that are doing something to us. And I think habit is exactly the way to think about that. There's a sense in which our material environment propels certain kinds of rhythms and routines and rituals, for good or ill, they just do. And over time, our immersion in those environments with their rhythms and rituals do something to us, and what they do is instill in us habits. Now, what I mean by habit isn't just like the routine you go through, it's like this disposition of character that gets embedded in you because of your practices, right? So in that sense, you could say some material environments more than others will foster aesthetic habits. They will foster habits of appreciation for beauty, fullness, meaning, significance. And other kinds of material environments and other kinds of rhythms, routines, and rituals will flatten those capacities within us. They will just entertain us to death, or they will distract us to death. And in a sense, a part of our souls, I think, shrivels in those environments because we are made for glory. We are made for beauty. We are made for goodness and truth. So yeah, I think it's a matter of being intentional and asking, what are the rhythms that my household propels me to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, uh, looking at what our habits are, how we have even trained ourselves to be disposed to different ideas in certain ways. Um, if we are stuck at home, how do we kind of take an analysis of our space and how it's actually influencing us? It's so hard as fish to know that we're wet, and it can be really hard to actually self-assess what the liturgies we've surrounded ourselves with are actually working in us. I've heard you use the phrase like a liturgical audit, which is just so how do you go about a liturgical audit?
Yeah, so it's interesting to sort of translate or focus that idea now on this question of our households, our homes. So liturgical audit is kind of my language in You Are What You Love for trying to like hit the pause button on your life, step back, and look at what you do and ask yourself, what is it doing to me? Right? So it's a way of, it's a little bit like the fish trying to jump out and see water for the first time. What we have to do is try to hit this pause button and get into this reflective space where we take the things that are familiar and everyday and common to us, and we sort of put on a new set of lenses so that they start to look strange and say, what if I had never seen this before? And now I ask, okay, what is this ritual propelling me to want? What's this rhythm propelling me to become? What story am I rehearsing when I go through this routine? And I think you can imagine that liturgical audit sort of transferring now. You're cooped up in your living room for hours, right? You're cooped up in the rec room. And all of a sudden, it's almost like you have opportunity to just look at your walls. I mean, you could almost just start by saying, okay, let's look at our walls. And what story, in a sense, this sounds kind of crazy, but what vision of human flourishing would somebody guess if they looked at our walls? Do you know what I mean? How do we surround ourselves? Now, the reason why I don't think this is a crazy idea is I've been really influenced by a thought that I learned from a playwright and writer from the 19th century named Oscar Wilde. Actually, I keep his edition here by my desk. This is a little article, sort of a dialogue he wrote called "The Critic as Artist." And one of the things that Wilde said is, our aesthetic temperaments, he said, our susceptibility to beauty isn't so much the fruit of like a curriculum of study. It's the fruit of the water we swim in. It's a result of the environments that we embed ourselves in. And interestingly, he said, in that sense, the way you decorate your home says something significant about what you think the human soul aspires to. Do you know what I mean? And interesting, he didn't necessarily mean, by the way, always having Jesus-y pictures on your wall. Do you know what I mean? That wasn't the point. In fact, one of his examples was wallpaper. He said, so I'm a huge devotee. I don't know if this will show up for folks, but I'm a huge devotee of designer and artist from the 19th century in England named William Morris. And Morris was the father of what we now know of as the arts and crafts movement. It became both an interior design style, a furniture style, but also, I don't know if people can see over my shoulder, my wallpaper is
I was
William
about to bring it up.
Wallpaper, yeah, and it's
His.
it's
Sorry,
actually,
I cut you off. You said it's actually his design.
It's his, yeah. So this is my office. The space in which I create is draped in William Morris's what's called the willow boughs design. And this was kind of when my wife and I were trying to discern about whether to make a move. The wallpaper in this room was a sign from God that this was a sort of creative space, because I just tried to imagine my own imagination sort of incubating in this space. And then I got a Morris chair to match it and things. So there's a sense in which I think we can all, it doesn't require wealth to become intentional about the way we adorn our homes. And I think there's a huge difference between unreflectively acquiring knickknacks to fill space versus intentionally becoming people who invest in a lamp or a painting or a small sculpture that is just packed with meaning and significance, and to see it on our mantle is to be transported into a story about the fullness of being human. And again, you can do this by being a really smart thrift store shopper. You can, I don't want people to feel like only the wealthy can be patrons of the arts. We can all be patrons. We just need to sort of embrace the calling and become intentional about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what are some maybe practical steps once, you've described this stepping back and assessing? What are some practical steps in going about creating new habits, new liturgies, developing more intentionality? You can just say be more intentional, but how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And around these specific questions of sort of beauty and the arts in our homes and our it's a good question. I mean, I think first of all, I do think that this should be a communal endeavor as well. So I actually think one of the best things that we can do is find those friends that we can think with about these sorts of things. So, and there's also a practical element to this too, which is if you find it difficult to make your own home strange and sort of see it for what it is, right? If you can't jump out of the water, having somebody else come into your home that you trust and that you value and that you share the same story with, and say, tell me, what do you see? What do you, and then you sort of trade with one another in being a gift of another set of eyes, right? I think that's a really tangible expression of the Spirit's notion of community, of the body helping one another in that respect.
You shape the space that will shape me.
Exactly. Yeah. And to also, we're going to expand our horizons in doing that too, right? I think we all need to have our aesthetic sensibilities stretched. A second practical, and again, I hope this is the sort of thing that you had in mind, but if we're getting like super concrete and practical, I actually think one way to begin being a patron and cultivating one's sensibilities in this regard is with some really good subscriptions to magazines. Like, and I mean this like, so for example, I subscribe to a photography magazine called Aesthetica, which is this just super cool set of images that, find me. I don't go find them, right? The great thing about a subscription is, okay, I sort of say, all right, I want to expose myself to this rhythm of receiving these images in my house every month. And then what happens is it becomes this almost like providential way of me learning new sensibilities. We should also remember too that arts aren't just visual, right? So I subscribe to the Paris Review, which is a literary quarterly. I would love it. I'll say, folks, I think a great way to invite art into your house is to subscribe to Image Journal. But one thing that does is it puts you into a different community of conversation. You start seeing, oh man, I could imagine living with that painting. I could imagine what would it mean for that photograph to be a print on our wall, and what story would we be living into. And then I would say the third thing to do is find ways to cultivate relationships with artists. I think the art that is most meaningful in our home is the art that we've bought from friends who are artists. And I know that that's not always easy for everybody to know, but the fact is there are probably always more artists around you than you realize, right? They're kind of like spiders. You're never more than 8 feet away from a spider. And you're never more than, a few blocks away from an artist. And there's a sense in which, and I think this is what Renew the Arts is about, is building that community and network so that people can meet and learn about artists and the work that they're doing. But I think the more you build a personal relationship with artists, this is always the way patronage worked, you understand the story that is informing their creativity. And in a way then, to have a piece of art by them in your home is like having them in your home. It's a less lonely place. I know when the quarantine first started, I want to say it was like the second day, and you're just like, you're trying to figure out what is this going to mean for us. And so one of the things we did is we created a little playlist by singer-songwriters who are our friends. And we thought, so of course everybody can listen to music, but man, did it ever make a significant difference when we were listening to music from people that we've been on retreat with, or that we know, and we know their stories and we can picture them where they are. I think that relationality with artists is a huge part of learning how to curate a home in that regard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's nothing quite like a good guide. And man, if I have felt so blessed, like the most fun I've ever had in a gallery is with an artist, because if I'm not an artist, then how am I going to know what's going on? Not necessarily on a macro level, although sometimes that too, but on a micro level, it's like, wow, look at that brushstroke. Why don't you zoom in and adore this with me, because I'm going to pass over it. I used to make furniture for a living, and I can look at a table and see a million things that people aren't going to see. And what's really fun about that is I can show them. And having artists and craftsmen as friends to guide you in appreciation, because you can see something and not see it. I think you even hear that in Jesus's words, like, he who has ears, let him hear. It's like, well, I have ears. Of course I'm going to hear. But are you? And you have eyes, but do you see? Some of the first exercises for novice or beginning artists is, whenever you first try to draw something, it's like, are you actually seeing the thing, or are you projecting an image you have in your mind of what you think it should look like? You know what I mean? And so whenever you draw a person, are you drawing something more like your ideal in your head, or some sort of image in your head of what it should become? Or are you actually seeing the odd, shades and shapes and the things that actually make up that person right now? And being able to see things clearly and having a guide who is an artist or craftsman reveal that to you is really important.
Yes. Yeah, I still remember a very special day. This is, probably a dozen years ago now, where Mako Fujimura met me at the Museum of Modern Art and walked me through the Picasso room. And you just see things that you never ever could have seen before. I think, by the way, that's one of the most fun aspects of becoming somebody who appreciates the arts, is criticism. Good criticism actually deepens your capacity to appreciate. And that deepening of appreciation is exactly why you'll start to find more meaning and significance in, a humble, out of the way work that nobody else has discovered, versus just some IKEA mass printed Van Gogh. Do you know what I mean? Which is so ubiquitous and flat that you'll never get a deeper appreciation of it as that print. Whereas this little sculpture that your friend has produced is going to keep giving to you in ways that you can't anticipate right now, which is always, I think, a real treasure.
Absolutely. And it doesn't even always have to be serious. I remember you mentioned, a little, maybe a figurine. My wife and I, before we were married, saw at a garage sale this egg, and out of the egg was emerging a lion. And that was all. One of his paws was broken, and it was so bizarre that we couldn't not buy it for 10 cents. And it, hung around as just this piece of like, what in the world is going on here? We ended up giving it to a friend, and they now have it displayed And I don't know. There's really interesting humor involved too. Like it doesn't have to necessarily be so serious. It can be whimsical, and and this idea of gift giving with art too ties into what you're saying as developing these liturgies as a community, because yeah, you pass things around, and the interesting thing about gifts is that their meaning grows as it
Yes.
passes through different hands.
Yes.
And yeah, yeah,
No,
no.
I love that. And I think, I mean, I do, I'm very pro whimsy, because I actually think at the heart of art is play. And so it doesn't, I mean, obviously there's a kind of art that is doing a somber work, but it's actually the play of light and color and sound, which is how art works. And so playfulness is really an important component of art, and we shouldn't lose that. Sometimes I love that story of gifting the crazy lion egg to your friends, because it's also a meaning that's shared, and it's the sort of thing that when given, the meaning sort of multiplies, as you said. I think that's really true.
Right, right. Because now it's not just a weird lion egg. It's Justus and Anikat's weird lion egg,
Yeah.
and it means something to us about the object and the person. Now these people are connected to it, and it represents not just humor, but humor in the context of a particular friendship and conversations that happen around it and stuff. I want to jump to the last point, and I saw a phrase in your latest piece in Image, which you already mentioned Image, but anyone listening should definitely, I encourage them to check out Image. Image has been doing really good work for a long time, and if you want to invite better art into your home, and that's not in any judgmental way, that's just if you want to kind of raise the bar, then definitely I encourage people to set up a subscription to Image Journal. But in your latest piece, in that you talked about the liturgy of distraction versus reflection, which I feel like is probably incredibly timely, because we're all stuck at home. And my idea at the outset was, oh wow, I'll have so much time, I'll get through this, literally this big stack of books sitting right here, and I'll be able to think so much and maybe do some more writing, and I see, even with the time that extra time I've been given, it's so easy to get it fritters away. And this idea of a liturgy of distraction versus reflection is amplified in this moment. And I would ask people who are listening, have you had a liturgy? Have you had a habit of reflecting in this incredible moment that you've been given, which could be capitalized for reflection and should be, and you're almost forced to reflect unless you manage to just distract yourself against all odds? Can you bring enough distraction into your life? Not that it's hard, but it's incredible that so much distraction is immediately available. So do you mind speaking into those different liturgies, how those flesh out, and then encouraging, how would you encourage someone who's listened to this, and we're going to be directing them to our online art gallery and art sale, how would you encourage people to, especially if this is their first purchase, like how to step into the position of saying, oh, I guess I'm an art collector. I guess I'm a buyer of art.
Yeah, I mean, so much to say. I think you're right that we've learned that um, it turns out that we didn't just need more time to be less distracted. There was some other diagnosis of why we were so distracted, and it's because we've now. I want to make two qualifications. One is, as somebody who's an empty nester and has this really quiet house, I'm intensely aware that the experience of young families at home with children, working and schooling sounds insane to me. So I God be with you. No guilt. It's hard to carve out. The second thing I do think we should just say too, it is amazing. I think the thing I'm learning about myself is there is something so psychologically consuming about the involuntariness of our sequester. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I'm sitting in this office. I could have written 3,000 words today, but today was just one of those days where you're like, somehow the stir craziness is just eating imaginative space, and it's driving me crazy. And I do think we have to just be gentle with ourselves a little bit and say, yeah, there is a difficulty to this. Now, I think what it probably highlights is if we didn't have rhythms and liturgies of reflective contemplation coming in to the pandemic, um, they weren't just going to magically appear just because you can't leave home, right? So you realize, okay, so this does require a degree of intentionality, and in fact it will always require intentionality to create rhythms so that you resist the pull of all the entertaining distractions and give yourself to more focused contemplation. And practically that just means like, how can you build an expectation in your household that this hour here and that hour there are sort of non-screen contemplative times, right? This is uh, uh, Justin Early's book, The Common Rule, is something that another book that people might appreciate because it's really about concretely setting up habits around technology and things, which I think is helpful. I think what has to happen is every household has to basically commit to one another to say, we're going to have a pattern in this house where at our house, it's beginning of the morning and end of the day are reading and contemplation times. And those are just sort of, it's just a given. I mean, it takes time. The intentionality requires saying, okay, we're going to make a choice. You might even like put an egg timer on for yourselves or something, but we're going to start building these rhythms so that we create these non-distracted contemplative moments in our day. And you'll be surprised that like an exercise regime, at first it's a slog and you hate it and it's so difficult, but then eventually you get to the point where you couldn't have your day without it. And I think to realize it takes time to get there. And then I think one cool thing to then do with that is to say, well, one thing I'm going to do with my hour at the end of the day is I'm going to I've been buying these art books for 5 years. I'm actually going to pull one out every night and just spend time contemplatively, letting images wash over me in ways, and to realize your imagination is being shaped even if you're not always having thoughts about the thing that you are encountering, right? Like I trust that a lot, actually. Sometimes both when I read the Psalms in the morning and when I read poetry at night, I'm trusting that there's always more going on in my imagination than I'm even processing. And I think that's the kind of sensibility that good patrons, good collectors, good curators need to trust themselves to become people who can then recognize beauty that is significant for them. I think it's important that people don't imagine, oh, I have to figure out what everybody else thinks is worth buying or what everybody else thinks is significant. There is always going to be an element of a dance and a matchmaking between your sensibilities and story and what that artist is creating. And it is not the same for everybody. And I think that's very liberating.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to a lawyer who had been collecting art for not a really long amount of time. And he was really excited about it. And I asked him, like, what was the moment when you realized, oh, I like buying art? And he said, when I realized that good art is art that I like. And philosophically, we could tease that out and perhaps parse it into some good ideas and bad ideas, because I don't necessarily agree with it all the way. But this liberating notion of I can walk into a gallery and say, I don't like that, and I don't necessarily have to be able to defend the reason why I don't like it right now. But I can also say, I like this, and I'm not sure why. I just do, and feel like I don't have to answer to some sort of art police.
Yes.
And there's a huge amount of pressure there because it can be such a cerebral or even like, I don't know.
It can be intimidating.
Yeah. So realizing, hey, I can just like what I like. And at Renew the Arts, we definitely encourage people to grow in their taste and develop their taste. All the things that you're talking about, self-assess. I think one of the reasons Christian art has been bad for the last 150 or so years is that Christian taste has been bad for the last 150 or so years. So it's like, well, we can cast a vision for creatives, but what really needs to happen is to also cast a vision for our taste to develop. So I'm
Yes.
certainly not saying that any of that isn't important, but there is a freedom of saying, well, start with what you like and then learn to like things that are better.
Yes, yeah.
Um,
It's interesting. I mean, it's a little hard to do this right now, except there is a version of this. But that's another reason why I think when we were talking about practical ways of just fostering rhythms, um, I think one of the most gratifying things for my wife and I as parents is that our kids are complete art museum rats. So whatever city they go to, they always find the art museum because that's what we did as a family. And there's a sense in which to go to a museum is learn to apprentice yourself to the wisdom of art's past. And I think that's exactly the kind of investment. And what's cool happening right now during the pandemic is so many museums are getting really creative at giving you digital tours and really well curated tutorials on works of art. So it's actually a great season in which to learn a lot about art just by on Instagram, which is kind of a silver lining for sure of our moment.
yeah, yeah, and we'll try to link out to some of those. There are some really great offerings. Well, thank you, man. Thank you so much for your time
Yeah, this has been great.
and for the work that you've done in moving this conversation forward and the books that we mentioned and otherwise. I really appreciate it.
Well, and I love what you guys are doing, and I love the idea of this gallery being a place where art lovers can meet the work of artists. I think it's a great idea, and hope there'll be lots of matches made.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Justice.
Hmm.